Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 250 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Sobalski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Well, we are at episode 250. I can't believe it. This is an episode just about every week for the better part of 5 years, which is a lot. Oh my gosh. And a lot of different topics and a lot of different people. And it's just been such an exciting journey. I'm just so excited to be here at episode 250, as I'm sure you can tell. And the first thing I want to say is just thank you so much for listening. So many of you have been listening to me for 5 years, 3 years, 2 years. And I can't tell you how much it means to me that you are with me every week. You invite me into your homes and your cars, and you take me with you on your walks. You listen in your trucks on your long haul truck rides. Thank you, truckers, for sending me emails. Appreciate it. I'm really glad I can help you make your work easier. And a lot of people will listen to this podcast sometimes as a way to feel calm, maybe right before bed. And I just appreciate so much you inviting me into your homes every week, into your ears every week to just talk about really exciting stuff about the Middle Ages. And I really appreciate the letters and the social media messages that you've sent me that show me that this is something that is very positive in your life. Some of you have written to me to say that this podcast has helped you through some things. And I gotta be honest, it's helped me through some things as well. And I'm really just so happy to be part of that journey for you. So thank you so much for listening every week. I just really needed to say that right up front. Some of you are new here, thanks to This Is History Presents the Iron King, so welcome. I'm very glad that you're here. This is like Dan-splaining every week with a different person. And for those of you who enjoyed those episodes of This Is History Presents the Iron King, where Dan and I were just being ridiculous, if you want to find out what we are like, sort of much more uncensored, you should listen to him being a guest on this podcast in May. You might enjoy that one quite a lot. I really appreciate you being here if you've come here through that podcast, because I had never done narrative history before. And I'm really happy that you enjoyed it, especially that you enjoyed it enough to add this podcast to your playlist. There's always more room for medieval podcasts on your playlist. I mean, I don't think we've filled up the airwaves enough yet. So thank you for allowing me to be part of your playlist. I started this in 2019. As a way to reach out to people and share all the wonderful research that's going on in the archives. So I'm not a person who spends a lot of time in archives myself. That's not where my skills lie. But one of the things that I wanted to do was to bring these bits of research out so that people can see them and interact with them. And I really do feel like over the past decade that we're really making a lot of change in the way that people see the Middle Ages. You can see a change that people are not dismissing it the way they did even 10 years ago. And that is just so gratifying to me. I know that I might sound a bit like a broken record when I say this, but I really feel like if we practice looking at the Middle Ages with open eyes, extending our empathy and our compassion to these people who seem both far away and familiar to us, that we are practicing how to extend empathy and compassion to each other, everyone who's here on the planet right now. And I think anyone who looks around in the news or just in their neighborhood recognizes that that is something that we can definitely use a lot more of in the world. What did Burt Bacharach say? What the world needs now is love. I'm not going to say it. But I think it's important that we start with our joint, collective, bookish, nerdy interest in the medieval world and then extend it from there. So thank you for being part of this personal mission for me. I'm so glad to have you here. This week's episode is just going to be like a potpourri. I find that there are a whole bunch more of you listening, thanks to This Is History. And I figured this could be an opportunity to get to know you, to get you to know me a little bit better, and just kind of to have some fun talking about interesting things that I've learned over the last 5 years from my guests and outside of the podcast, and just kind of dig into some medieval nerdery with the type of factoids that you can toss out at a party. A lot like Olaf from Frozen 2, if you're parents. I'm always full of like all this trivia. And I figured today is a day where we could just share some fun talking about these medieval bits of trivia. So today's episode is just going to be a potpourri of the medieval world to celebrate episode 250. So I'm going to start hitting you with facts right after this. One of my favorite parts of recording the Medieval podcast is that I make friends when I do it. So when I'm speaking to people, usually I'm meeting them for the first time. I might have read their work or have come across it, and they may have come across my work, maybe not. But when we are recording for the podcast, that's our first meeting. And so I feel like you can really hear the friendships being formed over that time. And I think that that is one of the beautiful things about this podcast is like just about everybody who's been on the podcast, we are still friends today and exchange emails and messages and things like that. We have all the love for each other, and you're seeing this happening in real time. So I hope that's a positive part of your day. It's definitely a positive part of my week and my life. And I learn so much every week. I learn so much. I read all the books. In case this is something that you don't know about me, I do read all the books before I speak to the people on the podcast. So I'm up on what they've talked about, and I learn so much from them. I mean, I think when you are in front of the microphone, it may seem like you're omniscient, like I will know everything already, but I'm learning along with you a lot of the time. And it's just so awesome. So here are some of the things that I've learned over the last 5 years that I just thought were super interesting and fun or funny and silly, or things that maybe people ask about a lot that I thought I would share with you. So one of my favorite little factoids comes from David Green's book. And David Green wrote about the 100 Years' War. He was like episode 3, I think, of the podcast. This is when I still didn't know how to use the sound system. So if you are listening to that, you go back to that, my apologies. I was really learning how to do this stuff from zero. And David Green has in his book at one point that some people, preachers of course, thought that the Black Death in 14th century was caused in part because men wore their hose too tight. So their woolen hose was so tight that they couldn't properly kneel down to pray. And so everyone was just a bad Christian at the time. And that is one of the reasons for the Black Death. So now you know the Black Death is not caused by bacteria. It's caused by people having their hose too tight. The next little bit of trivia I have for you is from John Wyatt Greenlee, who became such a celebrity on Twitter talking about medieval eels. And I love that for him. And I still feel bad that for episode 100, I accidentally left him off the email chain, so he wasn't part of that. But I'm really sorry, John Wyatt. You know that I'm still a big fan of yours. One of the things that he mentioned on the podcast and in his other work is that people would occasionally pay their rent in eels. So if this is a factoid you haven't come across before, I think is really interesting. Paying your rent in eels makes a lot of sense when people are eating fish on special holy days throughout the medieval calendar. And speaking of fish, one of the things I didn't get to talk about with Richard Hoffman when he was on talking about fish is apparently there was a relay system that would allow you to get fresh fish from the sea to Paris within something like 24 hours. So you could get fish from the sea in the Parisian marketplace, and it was still relatively fresh. I think that's amazing. Like, imagine the coordination it would take. People with carts full of fish that's actively starting to decay, getting it to Paris super fast. I think that's really interesting. One of the things that people who were listening to This Is History know is when I was researching Philip the Fair, I learned that he had his heart buried in a different place from his body, which is kind of normal at the time, although the church was not a big fan of it. And somebody said it was the size of a bird's. And so if you didn't spend much time learning about Philip the Fair, he was not a very nice guy. And I love that someone took the time to gossip that his heart was the size of a bird. And speaking of Capetian stuff, one of the things that Justine Fernhaber Baker didn't mention on my podcast, but it comes out in Dan Jones's podcast, is that there was a bad lawyer, and I mean like bad as in hard lawyer, that went down to try and crack some skulls in Gascony, and his name was Cheese. So if you feel like you need to pick yourself a very tough guy nickname, Cheese is up for grabs now, I think. When I was looking into medieval health for something, I can't remember, it was probably for Life in Medieval Europe, I came across this little factoid in Avicenna's book. And Avicenna is a guy from the Islamic world. He is a doctor, and he knew everything about everything. And he mentions that the best kind of water that is going to be like the most healthy for you is distilled water, which is really an interesting thing when you think about it. There's no germ theory at the time, but he still knows distilled water is the purest you can get. And he also thinks that you should wick it to get pure water, to filter it through wool. And one of the reasons he says you should do this is to make sure that you're not just swallowing leeches from your water source. So there you go. If there's a zombie apocalypse, make sure you don't just grab a glass of water from a pond because you might swallow a leech. It's better to wick it or distill it. I think one of the things that people already know from my work or from reading other people's work, including our beloved Eleanor Yanaga's work, is something that Ruth Mazo-Karras mentioned when she was on the podcast. And Ruth Mazo-Karras is like a particular hero of mine. I love her work. And she mentions that you could get married in the Middle Ages without a ceremony, just exchanging words and then consummating the relationship afterwards. So if you didn't already know that about the Middle Ages, I think that's a fascinating little nugget that you could just say, hey, do you want to get married? And then if you go behind a haystack and complete your business, you actually are legally married. So you probably already know that if you're a fan of this podcast. But did you know that in Italy, they also had government brothels that were created to make sure that men stayed straight? So there was this worry that men who were super into fashion in Italy were going to switch teams. And so they had government regulated brothels to make sure that they stayed straight. So now you know. That is something you can find out in Ruth Mazo-Karras' work, along with all sorts of really fascinating information. Something that, again, you probably already know, but if you don't, I think it's fascinating. You might wonder where the Plantagenet dynasty gets its name from. And it actually gets its name from a flower that was worn in the hat of Geoffrey of Anjou, who was married to Empress Matilda. They had Henry II. And so this flower, Plantagenista, is the one that gives the whole Plantagenet dynasty its name. It's kind of interesting because the early generations of this are called the Angevin dynasty after Geoffrey of Anjou. But the whole dynasty, Plantagenet, is named after a flower that he just decided looked good in his hat, which I adore. And speaking of this Angevin moment in English history, if we look at 1215, we have the year of the Magna Carta, right? And I think many historians have said Magna Carta is great, really important. But one of the other things, and maybe the more important thing that happened at that time, was the clergy got together and had the Fourth Lateran Council. So they got together and they decided to make sure that they had codified a whole bunch of rules about all sorts of things like marriage. This is also when they decided that Jews should wear a yellow symbol on their outfits to show that they are Jewish. So this is something that actually goes way back in history, unfortunately. They decided a whole bunch of things. Priests shouldn't be married or even pretending they're married. They had stuff going on about usury in the Fourth Lateran Council. And they also outlawed trials by ordeal. So when people are talking about ordeals, this is when you would toss someone into a pond or something like that and decide if they sunk, then they were innocent. And if they didn't sink, then they were heretics. So again, I think this is an important little nugget of information to sort of pass around. First of all, you wouldn't just pick a pond. You would dig a specific pit for it, and it would be blessed by a priest. And then the reason that sinking meant that you were innocent was it meant you were accepted by the holy water. You weren't rejected by it. So a priest is really involved in this whole idea of ordeal, also in ones with hot irons, hot water, like reaching for a pebble in the bottom of a boiling cauldron of water, that kind of thing. So ordeals, they were not super popular even by 1215, but they're outlawed in 1215 because it's not right to call God down to make a judgment like this. Also, people thought you could cheat on them. They didn't find it very reliable. So I think when people talk a lot about the Middle Ages, they imagine that ordeals are happening all the time. Actually, they're outlawed by 1215. So if people are conducting ordeals in different places, it's not sanctified by the church. It's not supposed to be happening. So this is something that I'm almost sorry to tell you because it's something that you're probably going to want to correct a lot in discussions about the Middle Ages with other people. I had Orietta de Rold on the podcast, a year ago, 2 years ago, to talk about paper. And that was really, really fascinating on its own. Paper, how it gets to Europe, what it's used for, including things like gift wrap. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting, because I'm a stationery nerd, is that you can buy notebooks in different colors in the 14th century. So like you could buy a blank notebook. This is something that I didn't actually know at the time, because usually you'd be getting like a quire, so a bundle of a few sheets together that might be blank, but usually you'd be writing on them before you bound them together. But Orietta found that you could actually buy journals of different colors so that you could keep your bookkeeping straight in the 14th century, which I think is amazing. And on the topic of stationery, because I love it, something that I mentioned in Life in Medieval Europe, I think, is that the reason that you can go to the drugstore today and get paper and ink and drugs at the same place is that back in the day, people who were apothecaries found that they can make ink very well because of their skills in combining things together to make medicines. So they started to sell ink, and then they figured, well, we can sell ink. We might as well sell paper or parchment in the same spot. So that the apothecary shop became a place where you could get pre-mixed medicines and pre-mixed ink. So this is something that goes all the way back to the Middle Ages, and it's because of the mixing skill of apothecaries. I don't think I've done a whole episode on Joan of Arc before, and this is probably something that I should fix in the future. I mean, there are so many topics to cover, but Joan of Arc is a super fascinating one. And something that maybe people don't know about her is that she didn't go straight to the fire from the get-go. She actually recanted the first time she was brought before a pyre as if she was going to be burned. She recanted her testimony. She decided she was going to take it all back, say the voices that she heard were demons. She did this because she was promised that she was going to be spending time in the company of women, given women's clothes to wear. She's going to be treated better than she had been treated in prison over the time that she had been a prisoner. It wasn't until a few days later when the inquisitors came back, or the judges came back to her cell, that she really loses it. And you can actually find her testimony online, and you'll really see a difference between the person who was testifying before and then the person who's testifying after this 3-day period. I think it's 3 days between her moment where she recants and the moment where she takes that all back and says the voices that she heard were angelic, and that she was told what she was supposed to do by God, and that the real kicker was that she was wearing men's clothes. She had put them back on. There might be an indication that she didn't have women's clothes to wear, so it was men's clothes or nothing, and she decided she was going to wear these men's clothes. So Joan of Arc is an interesting case. I don't think that it diminishes her in any way to recognize that she recanted first, but I do think that this is a rich part of her story that is not often told, this very human aspect where she gets afraid and then she decides, no, I'm going to stand in what her truth was, that these voices that she heard were angelic. So there is so much more to learn about Joan of Arc. Lots of people have written on her, including Helen Castor. One of the most fascinating books that I read in the course of doing this podcast was Emanuele Lulli's book on measurement. So if you look in the list of my podcast episodes and you're like, measurement, and it seems like it might not be the most interesting topic, let me assure you, it's really interesting, because there's this question about fairness, right? If you're starting to trade things with people, say in a post-apocalyptic world, you need to trade things with people. You need to know how big these things are supposed to be, how much they're supposed to weigh. And so there's some cities, and Emanuele has pictures in his book where there are like slots carved into the walls of the city, so you could insert the objects to see if they were the right size. That's fascinating. I mean, I'm Canadian, right? So I don't get to see these things every day. But I think that's so fascinating that you would actually build into the city walls places where you can measure the things you're going to sell. So if you haven't listened to Emanuele's podcast on measurement, check it out, because there's so much cool stuff happening. Another little bit of potpourri that you will know if you listen to this podcast, but you might not know, And so let me tell you is that the fruit that came from the tree in the Garden of Eden wasn't originally an apple. It was possibly a fig or a grape, not sure. But there was a lot of great work done by Azanyuddin Israel. And if you haven't listened to that podcast, it's fascinating the ways in which language shaped backwards through time, the way that people conceptualize what the fruit was in the Garden of Eden. And I know if this is the first time you're hearing it, you're like rapidly flipping through your Bible. It's really interesting to listen to Azan's work and see how it happened that it became translated as an apple. Something I always think is fascinating, and I don't know if I put it in any of my books or not, but it's just like one of my favorite little tidbits of information, is back in the day, in the late Middle Ages, when people started to circulate stories about Robin Hood. And it's hard to know when they started to really happen. He's mentioned in Piers Plowman as in people listen to stories of Robin Hood more than they listen to their priests, for example. But Robin Hood started showing up as a figure who would like appear at medieval festivals and take people's money as a fundraiser for things like fixing bridges and roads and stuff. And I just think that's amazing. You have this image of Robin Hood, somebody dressed up as Robin, taking people's money as a fundraiser. I think that's awesome. If you haven't listened to the podcast on pigs with Jamie Kreiner, I recommend it. Pigs are so interesting, and her book, Legions of Pigs, is just super interesting as well. And I don't know if you haven't listened to these things, if maybe you picture a medieval city as having like pigs just wandering around all over the place, and they were being driven from one place to the other. And sometimes people would have a pig in a backyard as well. And these pigs were actually pretty dangerous and deadly. They were hairy, and they would sometimes go after infants in their cradles, knock over the cradle, and sometimes eat them. So pigs are an actually fascinating part of the medieval world, and the one that maybe we don't picture when we're picturing a medieval street. But having listened to Jamie or this podcast, maybe we will picture the streets a bit differently. So one of the people I haven't had on the podcast, and I hope to rectify this in the future, is Geraldine Heng, who is like a legendary scholar in our field. She's done a lot of work on the invention of race, for example, is probably her most popular book, her most influential book. But I remember coming across Jerry when she was talking about a shipwreck, a ship that was on its way from China to the Middle East, and it was full of ceramics. And this is fascinating because Jerry has been able to show that ceramics were being mass produced in China in the Middle Ages, like early Middle Ages, 9th century-ish, where people were firing thousands of ceramics at the same time. And she suggested thinking about this in terms of an industrial revolution that's happening. Now, I'm not a big scholar of what's going on in China. I came through the European tradition, as so many of us did. But like, there's some really cool stuff happening in medieval China at the time. I really want to have more people talking about China on the podcast. But the thing about firing thousands of ceramics at the same time just blew my mind. And if you ever come across Jerry Heng's work, it's always really good. For people who are like completely new to my work, you may not have heard that Ulrich von Liechtenstein is actually probably a real guy. He's a terrible person, but it seems that he may have been a real guy. At any rate, there is a whole book called The Service of Ladies where he talks about his efforts to win the hand of this really super reluctant woman. And if you read it with 21st century eyes, it's completely creepy. But if you read it from medieval eyes, it's like a tale of a guy who has like the ultimate amount of chivalry. He's in tournaments. He, I think at one point, loses his finger and sends it off to his love to prove his love to her. She is unimpressed by this, as I think anybody would be receiving a severed finger in the mail. But he actually seems to have been a real guy. And you can find his book, The Service of Ladies, fairly easily. I think the version that I have was translated by Kelly DeFries. But the real Ulrich was not nearly as nice as Heath Ledger's character in A Knight's Tale, which is still the best movie ever. One of the things that I found surprising in speaking to a scholar on my podcast was talking to Declan Taggart about Thor, because Thor has become, through Marvel, a person person, a figure, a god that is so clearly associated with things like thunder and lightning. And Declan's research has shown that Thor isn't always associated with thunder. So if you are interested in Thor, check that out, because not everyone associated Thor with thunder. He was a very important god, and like the mystery and sort of murkiness around his cult, his worship back in the day is very interesting. But he wasn't always the god of thunder. Another fun fact, our word clock comes from cloche, which is a bell. And this comes from those early alarm clocks that people were coming up with to wake up the monks in the monastery, and they would ring a bell. A lot of these clocks were using mechanics or water. I think that's a really interesting one. And so these clocks, these cloches would wake up the monks so that they could go roll down the stairs and go to worship. And if you haven't listened to Seb Falk's podcast, I think we just called it The Light Ages after his book. It's all about science in the Middle Ages. And now you know that alarm clocks come from cloche, bell. I spent some time thinking about Richard III this week, as I will be talking about with Peter in just a minute. And I learned a couple of really interesting tidbits about Richard III. One of them is that he seems to have been, this is according to Michael Hicks, who I haven't interviewed but read his book on this, that Richard III seems to have been the first king in England to have had his coronation oath spoken in English. So he said his coronation oath in English, which is really fascinating because this is not until 1483, so late. His coronation was also the first joint coronation, apparently, in English history. So he was crowned along with his wife, just like the latest king of England was as well. Recently, I learned about professional divers who did salvage on shipwrecks. I was speaking with Jane Stevens Crawshaw, so only a couple weeks ago, about this. And I think that's a fascinating bit of trivia, in that you have these people who are professional salvagers that will dive down. And when you think about this in the Middle Ages, this is a very specialized bit of work. And I imagine they had these salvagers all over the place. So if there's a novelist that needs a main character, this is a job. I think this is an awesome job to be doing in the Middle Ages. And imagine the training that you'd have to go through and the danger of salvaging from ships back in the day. I spoke with Charles Spencer about the White Ship a few years ago on the anniversary. I think it was the 900th anniversary of the White Ship disaster. And when that ship went down, there were also people diving on the wreck to see what they could find that had been left behind as well. And I just think this is fascinating work, especially in the ocean. So I live in the middle of Canada. I live by the Great Lakes, but I can't imagine diving in the ocean with all of that power, trying to move you around and trying to salvage a shipwreck. I think that's fascinating. Okay, so I have a few more bits of trivia. I hope this is fun. I mean, I'm having fun. And one of the things that people say, one of the nice things that people say on Apple Podcasts, for example, they find me enthusiastic, and I certainly am enthusiastic about all of these little bits of trivia. So for the people who saw on my social media or Dan Jones's social media or listened to This Is History Plus talking about the Cadaver Synod, this is when a pope was dug up and put on trial for being basically a terrible pope. And if you want to learn more about that story, we do talk about it in my episode with Jessica Warnberg, all about Rome and the popes. And she was just a great guest. And the history of the popes in the Middle Ages is scandalous and racy. This is why people keep coming up with sort of R-rated TV versions of the popes' lives, because they are wild. They are wild. And if you want to hear some of them, you can check out my podcast with Jessica Warnberg. The Cadaver Synod is one of those. Jessica does not do a corpse pope impression like Dan Jones. Maybe I should have asked her, but I didn't think of it at the time. One of the guests that was super fun to have on was Ken Dugen, talking about gallows. And I know that sounds very funny, talking about gallows was a fun episode, but Ken is just a super great guy. And we were talking about gallows and the reason that you have them, obviously, to hang people, but why do you have them in certain places? What do they mean? And one of the things that he will tell you in the episode and in his other work is sometimes people wanted to demonstrate that the person who had just been killed was a criminal. And so they might kill the person elsewhere and actually drag them to the gallows to show that this person was a bad person. So not only did executions happen on gallows, but if there was sort of vigilante justice that happened, sometimes you would have a corpse that would just appear on the gallows that was not hanged there. But people really wanted to make a statement about them. So I thought that was really an interesting thing. Not just because it's kind of titillating, but because it really tells us a lot about the way people thought about things like justice and how it should be served and what the signs of justice are, for example. And while I'm on this, I had Tracy on to talk about torture and justice. So if you have been listening again to This is History and thinking about the various ways that Philip the Fair killed people or tortured people, I would really recommend listening to Tracy's episode because she really pulls out the differences between what is torture, what is punishment, what do these things mean, why are they separate, and why were they allowed? So if you are interested in learning more about torture, Tracy is your woman, and she was on, early in the podcast catalog, so you'll have to go back a little bit. She's awesome as well. And I had Amanda McVey on to talk about masculinity and treason. So again, if we're thinking about the end of someone's life, if they are a criminal, how do we show this? What's important? I think that people tend to think of the Middle Ages as being a sadistic time. They just love to rip people apart on a gallows, for example. And it was in Amanda McVey's episode on treason and masculinity where we talk through the different symbolism of an execution. So it's not just that somebody gets their head cut off because they're terrible. Each of the little bits of an execution, especially a spectacular one, is very meaningful. So, for example, you might lose your head as a traitor. You might be hanged on the gallows because you are a thief, like you've stolen from the king. You might be disemboweled, which is horrific. But I didn't know until reading Amanda McVey's work that this disemboweling, for example, was to get rid of that part of the body from which the treacherous thoughts are coming. So if you're interested in symbolism around the body, for example, that's a really good episode as well. Okay, so this one I think is so important, and it felt like it didn't really appear too many places in the scholarship or maybe the broader discussion about serfdom. And I was thinking about this a lot because of the way people talked about COVID and how it was going to change the world and revolutions and really sort of comparing it to the 14th century. So when I found Mark Bailey's work on serfdom, I needed to have him on the podcast because he's discovered that the decline in serfdom in England, at least, is not because of the Peasants' Revolt. And I think this is really, really important scholarship because the general narrative has been there was the Black Death, and then there was the Peasants' Revolt. And because of the Peasants' Revolt, that's how serfdom declined. And actually, Mark's work shows this is not what happened, that serfdom declined sort of organically and sort of because of the Black Death. So things like you can't create a new serf in England. You can't just enslave somebody. They have to be born into it. And so as people are dying from the Black Death, you don't have new serfs being born, for example. I really thought this was important work. So if you're really interested in the 14th century or the way that people bounced back from the Black Death and what that looked like, I mean, Mark Bailey's episode is really cool because of the work that he did that showed that it wasn't actually the Peasants' Revolt that changed things for serfs in England, at least. I do want to drop in Balthazar by Brian Keane. So if you haven't listened to that episode, you don't know who Balthazar is. He is one of the three wise men. And over the course of the Middle Ages, he gains a whole story. So this is another thing that people in the Middle Ages are actually really well known for doing. They'll take a line out of the Bible involving a character and build an entire mythos around them. And I'm not saying this in a way that's meant to sort of put down this type of storytelling. I think this is actually a very critical part of the way people were worshiping in the time. But they would create these stories as a way to feel more deeply into the stories from the Bible. And one of these figures is one of the three wise men, Balthazar, whose story ends up being that of a Black African. And I think this is so relevant, critical, important to our discussion of the Middle Ages because of that central place that Balthazar had in so many stories and about the way he's portrayed. And Brian Keane and all of the people who worked on the book, all of those scholars look at the way that he's portrayed and how he shows up in art. If you want a discussion about race and faith and all of those things in the Middle Ages, Balthazar is a good place to start that journey, that discussion. Matthew Vernon's episode was also really great, although we tended to sort of stray further into the modern era about that. But especially if you're American or interested in American politics and ideas of race and the Middle Ages, Matthew Vernon's episode is the place to go to start that journey as well. And finally, something that perhaps is not so much about the Middle Ages, but about its importance and the reason why we should keep learning history is a discussion I had with Cliff Rogers. And Cliff studies gunpowder especially, and he does his work at West Point. And I asked him, why would you be teaching medieval studies at West Point? Why is it important to be teaching military personnel about the Middle Ages? Why is this important? And of course, his answer is very considered and longer than I'm about to say. But the part of it that I thought was really interesting was that Cliff mentions that medieval history and studying medieval history is a good exercise in putting together a case based on almost zero evidence. So putting together ideas based on a whole bunch of information that is missing. So you know that there is information missing, or you might not know that there's information missing, and you have to build your argument or your worldview or your perspective based on just a few fragments. And I do talk about fragments actually with Lisa Fagan Davis, so you can check that one out as well. But basically, using medieval studies as a lens to look at the way that you build a case based on fragmentary information. And I hadn't really thought before that about using the way that we study history to extend it to broader ways of thinking. And of course, Cliff has done a lot more thinking about that. And the way he explains this, I think, is worth listening to on its own. But it shows that learning about the past, learning about the Middle Ages, maybe especially, is valuable. It's valuable work. And I don't really need to say this to you because you're here because you find it valuable. But it is important to our world to be learning about its history and learning how to make these arguments based on fragmentary sources. And not only that, but one of the things that I really value in this podcast is reopening these debates. So you'll notice a lot of the people that I have on are looking at things in another way, or looking at things again, like Mark's work on serfdom, or Tom Smith's work on the First Crusade and the letters coming from the First Crusade. And I think that willingness to look at fragmentary information, make an argument, and also be flexible enough to change it and allow it to be shaped by new information, I think is so valuable. It might be a bit of a strange thing to say, I want to be a force for good in the world through medieval studies, because it might seem like medieval studies has nothing to contribute to the world other than entertainment or maybe making something like Game of Thrones look better. But I think it's important. And it's why I do what I do. And I am just so happy that you have been with me on this journey. And I hope that you've enjoyed spending this time together, kind of just nerding out about stuff, maybe learning some new things that you could tell other people about, because none of this stuff isn't meant to be closed up in books in chained libraries. The whole reason that I do this is to get the information out of the library, to get it to more people, to tell them about it, because it's exciting and it's fun. And I think that if you put joy into your work, it's contagious and it's going to have a positive ripple effect. So I hope that if nothing else, listening to this and hearing somebody just like enjoy nerding out about something they like this much is at least going to give you a smile, and maybe you'll pass that on as you go about your day today. And that you'll be back next week. I have more stuff for you, more coming. And I just really want to thank you so much for being part of the Medieval Podcast and for listening each week, for doing the things that will allow me to keep doing this, like listening to the ads or letting them at least play through, because that is how I fund this, as well as being patrons on patreon.com. All of that money helps to make my podcast keep running. as well as the other podcasts that are put out by Medievalist.net, and indeed supports Peter's work on Medievalist.net. So I just really want to thank you for helping me and supporting me, allowing me to spread this information and this joy about the Middle Ages further so that we can change people's attitudes about this time, and hopefully we can change people's attitudes about the way we look at evidence, the way we look at other people, the way we look at our history, and how we want to move forward into the future. So thank you so much for being with me for 250 episodes of the Medieval Podcast. Before we go, here's Peter from Medievalist.net to tell us what's going on with Medievalist.net. What's up this week, Peter?
Well, hey, but first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
Episode 250. Wow.
Yeah, I know. It's a big number.
It is. I was just kind of thinking back and like, man, there's so much content now on this podcast. You've spoken with hundreds of scholars and writers and historians, and wow, I think anyone listening, they're getting a nice introductory, more than an introductory level to the Middle Ages.
That's right. That's right. It's like a university course.
Yes.
Everyone is going to get their bachelor's degree in medieval podcast. That would be fun. Yeah, 250 episodes. It's a lot. And you've been on all the episodes, well, just about all the episodes, saying hello. So
indeed. I hope to be the guest on a couple more episodes. So, we'll find something to talk about for a good 40 minutes.
There's always something to talk about.
And also, congratulations on the Richard III Society of Canada. You were the invited speaker.
That's right. So on the weekend, I was the invited speaker. It was July the 6th, which was the anniversary of Richard's coronation back in 1483. And yeah, I was the invited speaker for the Canadian branch's 100th anniversary of the Richard III Society in general. So that was a really cool experience.
Yeah. Now I've heard that what you talked about and basically convinced the entire room was that Richard not only killed the princess in the tower, but he personally did it. I'm really surprised you were able to kind of convince everybody. I think they're going to change the Richard III Haters Society now.
Yeah, all of a sudden there's going to be like this badge that has a boar with like blood on his tusks. No, I absolutely did not say that. What I did say was that I don't have a dog in the fight. I just like looking into Richard and thinking about what an interesting guy he was. And he definitely is interesting no matter what your take is on his morals or his activities during his reign. So yeah, that was really, really fun. And of course, such an honor to be the speaker for 100th anniversary. As I said to the people in the room, I've studied history for a long time, but rarely do I get to make it. So that was really a good time.
Well, congratulations again. So yeah, pretty cool last week for you.
Yeah, it's a good week. It's a good week to be me. So how is it to be you this week, Peter?
Well, I've a little announcement to make because, we've been doing our online courses through Thinkific for the last couple of years now, and it's been growing really well. I've been really, really happy. And so we're actually having 5 courses running this fall, including yours on Calamity and Change and Introduction to the 14th Century. So yeah, students are signing up for that in droves. So cool.
Yes, I'm very excited about that. Yeah, we'll be talking about the 14th century for 6 weeks. I think it's going to be just super fun.
So I thought about jumping in myself and running my own class for this sometime. And so I decided to go with the Battle of Hastings, the Norman Conquest. And it's going to be a little different. It'll be a self-paced course. And what it is I'm really being a librarian here, right? And my aim is to explain what are the sources and studies we have about the Norman Conquest. So basically, I want to be your guide. If you want to look at the topic yourself, what you need to know, like what do you need to know about the Bayeux Tapestry? What about these chroniclers, books and articles, so you can study yourself. And it's going to be released September 1st, but you can now pre-order it right now with a discount on medievalstudies.thinkific.com.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome. And I think it's a good idea to have a librarian focused course because for people who have never studied the Norman Conquest or they need an introduction and they want to see what the sources are, that's really great. And also for people who are getting used to the idea of how you use a source, like which ones are credible and how do you find them? And I think it's a great idea to have that as a course is medievalstudies.thinkific.com, right?
That's right. That's right. So yeah, and I'll be our first self-paced course, but then we have yours and 4 other live courses that are just this fall.
Yeah, it's an exciting time. It's an exciting time for Medievalist.net, for my work, for all of the people who can study from home and get that education that was just not possible 20 years ago. You had to go to university to get it.
Yeah. I'm really proud that, the kind of work we're doing on that Thinkific platform and these classes. And I hope it's getting something for the students and also for the instructors.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're in this for the joy. I was going to say none of us are in this to get rich because we are really not, but we are definitely in it for the joy. So welcome to the club, Peter, with your own course going out on Thinkific in the fall. That's awesome.
Ooh.
So people can find out more about that and all sorts of new stuff, right, on Medievalist.net.
Indeed. Thanks so much.
For all 250 episodes of the Medieval Podcast, as well as hundreds of articles that I've written and thousands of articles written by other people, follow Medievalist.net on Facebook or X at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Sapolsky, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Geefrog. Thanks for listening and have yourself a wonderful day.